Nothing is wrong. There's no crisis unfolding, no urgent message waiting, no clear reason to feel on edge. Your life, at least in this moment, is relatively calm. And yet, you're waiting. Waiting for something to shift. For something to break. For something to demand your attention again. You may not even notice it consciously, but there's a quiet alertness beneath the surface. A sense that this calm won't last. That something is about to happen. That you shouldn't get too comfortable. And that raises a subtle question. Why don't you trust feeling okay? From the outside, this reaction seems unnecessary. Things are stable. You're functioning. There's no immediate threat. So why does your mind keep scanning? Why does it stay slightly tense, even in moments that should feel neutral or even good? This isn't pessimism. And it isn't a lack of gratitude. You're not rejecting peace because you prefer chaos. You're reacting to something learned. For a long time, calm may not have meant safety. It may have meant temporary relief. Moments where things were quiet, right before something went wrong. Periods of ease, followed by disruption. Stability that didn't last long enough to trust. So your system adapted. It learned not to relax fully. Not to settle too deeply. Not to believe that, okay, was something solid. Instead, it learned to stay ready. Ready to respond. Ready to adjust. Ready to manage what comes next. And that readiness became your baseline. So now, when life slows down, your body doesn't read it as safety. It reads it as uncertainty. Because uncertainty feels more familiar than peace. You may notice this most clearly during quiet moments. A calm evening where you can't fully relax. A good day that feels strangely fragile. A sense of well-being that you don't quite trust. Instead of enjoying it, part of you stays watchful. As if saying, don't get used to this. This reaction isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself as fear. It shows up as anticipation. A low-level expectation that something will need your attention soon. And that expectation keeps you from settling. For many people, especially those who learn to function through difficulty, stability feels suspicious. Not because it's bad, but because it hasn't been reliable. So your mind stays alert, not to ruin the moment, but to protect you from disappointment. Because being caught off guard once was enough. So you learn to expect disruption before it arrives. That expectation became a form of safety. If you anticipate problems, they hurt less when they appear. If you don't fully trust calm, you won't be shocked when it ends. This logic makes sense, especially if calm was never guaranteed. But it comes at a cost. You never fully arrive in moments of ease. You never let stability settle into your body. You're present, but guarded. So even when you're okay, you don't feel okay. You're already preparing for what comes next. This pattern often develops quietly. There's no single moment where you decide to mistrust peace. It builds over time. Through repeated experiences where things felt fine until they weren't. Where calm was followed by pressure. Where relief didn't last long enough to feel safe. Eventually, your system stops believing in, okay, as a stable state. It treats it as a pause. A brief window before effort is required again. So when things are calm, your nervous system doesn't relax. It waits. And waiting creates tension. Not panic. Not anxiety in the obvious sense. Just a subtle readiness. A feeling of being on standby. You might notice that you struggle to enjoy good moments fully. Not because you don't appreciate them, but because you're already bracing for their end. You may even feel uneasy when things are going well, as if something is missing, as if you should be doing something to prepare. This discomfort often gets misinterpreted. People think they're incapable of happiness, or that they're addicted to stress, or that they don't know how to enjoy life. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is vigilance. And vigilance is not a personality trait. It's a learned state. For a long time, staying alert kept you functional. It helped you respond quickly. It helped you manage change. It helped you avoid being overwhelmed. So your system learned to associate calm with vulnerability. Not because calm is dangerous, but because it removed the signals that told you what to do next. In pressure, your role was clear. In difficulty, your purpose was defined. Calm removes that clarity. And without clarity, the mind searches, scans for potential problems. It anticipates outcomes. It stays just tense enough to feel ready. This readiness becomes habitual. So even when nothing is wrong, your body acts as if something might be. That's why you don't fully trust feeling okay. Not because you don't want peace, but because peace hasn't been predictable. So instead of settling into it, you monitor it. You stay slightly distant from it. You treat it as temporary. And that distance prevents calm from becoming restorative. It becomes something you pass through, not something you inhabit. If any of this feels familiar, there's nothing wrong with you. You're not broken. You're responding exactly the way a system responds when stability hasn't been consistent. The real question isn't, why can't I relax when things are fine? It's, what did my system learn about calm? Because once you understand that, the rest begins to make sense. And that understanding is where change begins. To understand why you don't trust feeling okay, it helps to understand how the brain learns safety. The brain doesn't define safety by comfort. It defines safety by predictability. What happens often enough becomes what the system expects. So if calm has frequently been followed by disruption, the brain adapts. It doesn't relax into ease, it prepares for interruption. This isn't a conscious decision. It's conditioning. Over time, your nervous system begins to associate stability with vulnerability. Not because stability is harmful, but because it hasn't been reliable. When something good lasts, the brain asks, how long will this last? When things feel calm, the body wonders, what's coming next? This isn't pessimism. It's pattern recognition. The brain is designed to protect you, not to keep you comfortable. So it pays more attention to what ended calm than to calm itself. If relief was temporary, the system learns not to settle too deeply into it. Because settling creates exposure. When you relax fully and something goes wrong, the impact feels stronger. So the system tries to prevent that by staying partially alert. This partial alertness becomes the default state. You're never fully tense, never fully relaxed, always somewhere in between. This in-between state feels familiar, and familiar feels safe, even when it's exhausting. This is why calm can feel suspicious. Not because you don't want it, but because your brain hasn't learned it as a place where you can stay. Instead, it has learned calm as a transition point, a pause between demands, a brief window before action is required. So when things are okay, your system doesn't interpret that as a signal to rest. It interprets it as a signal to prepare. Preparation feels responsible. If you're prepared, you won't be caught off guard. If you're ready, you won't be overwhelmed. If you stay alert, you'll manage whatever comes next. So alertness becomes a form of self-care. But over time, that form of care becomes tension. Not loud tension. Subtle tension. A background vigilance that never fully turns off. You may notice it in your body. A jaw that doesn't quite unclench. Shoulders that stay slightly raised. Breathing that remains shallow even when you're safe. These are not signs of anxiety. They're signs of anticipation. Your system is not responding to a current threat. It's responding to a learned expectation. The expectation that calm is temporary. The expectation that things change quickly. The expectation that something will need your attention soon. This expectation shapes how you experience the present. You may struggle to enjoy good moments without mentally stepping outside them. You observe them rather than inhabit them. You evaluate them rather than feel them. Part of you stays slightly removed, as if saying, "Let's not get too attached." This distance feels protective, because attachment to calm feels risky when calm has ended abruptly before. So the brain limits how deeply you settle, keeps one foot out of the moment. This is why many people feel strangely numb during good periods. Not unhappy, just muted, as if enjoyment is capped. This isn't because joy is unavailable. It's because the system is regulating exposure. Full enjoyment would mean full trust. And trust hasn't felt safe. So the brain keeps things at a manageable distance. Another important aspect of this conditioning is how the brain prioritizes threat. Threat always gets more attention than safety. That's how survival works. One negative event carries more weight than several neutral ones. So even if calm has existed at times, a few disruptions can outweigh many stable moments. The brain remembers what broke the peace more vividly than the peace itself. So when things feel okay, the brain scans for signs that the pattern might repeat. It looks for small cues. A change in tone. A shift in mood. A sense that something is off. Often, nothing is actually wrong. But scanning itself creates tension. And tension reinforces the belief that something needs attention. This creates a loop. Calm appears. The brain scans. Scanning creates tension. Tension confirms the idea that calm isn't safe. And the loop continues. Over time, this loop becomes automatic. You don't choose to mistrust calm. Your system does it for you. And because this mistrust developed gradually, it feels like part of who you are. You may describe yourself as cautious, or guarded, or always prepared. But these traits aren't fixed. They're adaptive responses. Responses that once served a purpose. Perhaps you lived in environments where stability wasn't consistent, where things changed quickly, where you had to adjust often. So your system learned flexibility. Flexibility is a strength, but flexibility can turn into hypervigilance when rest is never fully safe. Then the system never powers down, even when there's no immediate reason to stay alert. This is why many people feel tired even when life isn't demanding. Not physically tired, mentally tired. Because vigilance consumes energy. Monitoring the environment. Monitoring yourself. Monitoring the future. All of that takes effort. And effort without rest leads to exhaustion. But resting feels unsafe. So the system stays caught between readiness and fatigue. This state often gets mislabeled. People think they're anxious, or stressed, or incapable of relaxing. But what they're actually experiencing is a brain that hasn't learned to trust stability. The solution isn't to convince yourself that everything is fine. The brain doesn't respond to reassurance. It responds to experience. It needs repeated evidence that calm can exist without being followed by disruption. That nothing bad happens when you let yourself settle. That you remain intact even when you stop preparing. But before that learning can take place, another layer needs to be explored. Because vigilance doesn't just protect you from external threats. It shapes your identity. And when your identity is built around anticipation, letting go of vigilance feels like losing yourself. That's where we need to go next. When your brain learns to expect threat, vigilance doesn't stay confined to moments of actual danger. It becomes a way of relating to yourself. At first, vigilance is a response. You stay alert because something might happen. You monitor because change feels likely. But over time, vigilance stops being something you do. It becomes something you are. You begin to identify with readiness. Being prepared feels responsible. Being alert feels mature. Being cautious feels wise. And slowly, almost invisibly, vigilance turns into identity. You're not just someone who pays attention. You're someone who's always on guard. Not in an obvious way. Not with panic or fear. But with a quiet, constant awareness that something could shift at any moment. This awareness shapes how you experience everything. You don't fully enter situations, you position yourself around them. You don't relax into moments, you observe them. You don't trust feelings, you evaluate them. Especially positive ones. Because positive states feel fragile when your system expects disruption. So instead of letting yourself enjoy calm, you monitor it. Is this real? Is this going to last? What am I missing? This monitoring feels subtle, but it has consequences. It keeps you slightly removed from your own experience. You're present, but not immersed. Engaged, but guarded. And that distance reinforces the belief that calm isn't something you can rely on. Another effect of this pattern is emotional forecasting. You don't just feel what's happening now. You anticipate how it might change. So when things are okay, part of your attention is already projecting forward. You imagine scenarios. You prepare responses. You rehearse reactions. Not because those scenarios are likely, but because anticipation feels safer than surprise. This habit of forecasting becomes automatic. Your mind moves ahead of the present moment. And when your mind isn't here, the present never feels fully stable. This is why calm feels incomplete. You're never fully in it. You're already beyond it. This pattern often creates confusion. You may ask yourself why you feel uneasy even when nothing is wrong. You may wonder why you can't settle, why peace feels shallow or temporary. The answer isn't that calm lacks depth. It's that vigilance is flattening it. Vigilance narrows attention. It limits how much experience you allow in. Because allowing more would increase exposure. And exposure feels risky when your system expects loss. So the mind keeps a buffer. It stays slightly detached. That detachment protects you from disappointment, but it also limits connection. Connection to others. Connection to moments. Connection to yourself. Another important aspect of this identity is control. Vigilance often pairs with a strong sense of self-control. You monitor your reactions. You regulate your emotions. You manage your behavior. Not because you distrust yourself, but because control feels like insurance. If you stay in control, nothing will spiral. If you stay composed, Nothing will catch you off guard. So control becomes a moral value. Letting go feels irresponsible. Relaxing feels careless. Trusting feels NVE. This belief system isn't conscious. You don't tell yourself these things explicitly. They're embedded in how you move through life, in how you respond to good news, in how you approach rest, in how you relate to ease. Ease doesn't feel earned unless vigilance stays active. So even when life offers stability, you keep your guard up, because lowering it feels like tempting fate. This is where hypervigilance becomes exhausting. You're not just watching the world. You're watching yourself. You notice shifts in mood, changes in energy, subtle emotional movements, and you try to regulate them preemptively. If you feel too good, you pull back. If you feel too calm, you stay alert. If you feel content, you remind yourself it might not last. This constant adjustment creates a quiet inner tension, not enough to be alarming, but enough to prevent rest. Over time, this tension becomes background noise. You forget what it feels like to be unguarded. And because you've lived this way for so long, it feels normal. You may even take pride in it. You see yourself as realistic, as grounded, as someone who doesn't get carried away. But realism can quietly turn into restriction. Not because you're wrong, but because you're limiting how deeply you allow yourself to live. Another consequence of this identity is difficulty trusting your own internal states. You don't take calm at face value. You question it. You don't trust ease to be meaningful. You assume it's temporary. So you stay slightly separate from your own feelings. This separation feels protective, but it also creates a sense of distance from yourself. You experience life through a filter. Not fully open, not fully closed, always prepared. And preparation becomes the main way you stay oriented. This is why the idea of letting go feels so threatening. It's not just about dropping vigilance. It's about losing a familiar sense of self. If you're no longer the one who anticipates, monitors, and prepares, who are you? This question isn't philosophical. It's visceral. Vigilance has given you coherence. It has told you how to move, what to expect, and how to respond. So releasing it feels like losing structure, even if that structure is exhausting. This is the paradox. The very thing that keeps you functioning also keeps you tense. And because it has worked for so long, your system doesn't want to give it up. It trusts vigilance more than peace. Because vigilance has history, peace feels new. And new things feel unreliable until they've been tested. This is why simply telling yourself to relax doesn't work. You can't talk a system out of an identity. You have to offer it a new experience. One where calm doesn't lead to loss, where settling doesn't lead to danger, where trusting the moment doesn't result in harm. But before that experience can be integrated, one more layer needs to be addressed. Because beneath vigilance and anticipation lies a deeper belief. A belief about what happens if you stop watching. And that belief quietly governs everything. That's where we need to go next. Beneath vigilance, beneath anticipation, beneath the constant readiness to respond, there is a belief that quietly shapes everything. A belief that says, if I lower my guard, something will go wrong. This belief is rarely conscious. It doesn't arrive as a clear thought. It lives in sensation, in the tension that returns when you start to relax, in the unease that appears when things feel stable, in the instinct to stay alert even when nothing demands it. For a system trained by unpredictability, lowering your guard doesn't feel like rest. It feels like exposure. Because exposure implies risk. When you've learned that calm doesn't last, trusting it feels irresponsible. As if enjoying stability is tempting fate. So your system stays ready. Not because you expect disaster, but because you don't trust continuity. Continuity hasn't been consistent enough to feel real. This is where many people misunderstand themselves. They think they're anxious, or pessimistic, or incapable of relaxing. But what they're actually experiencing is a protective belief that formed for a reason. At some point, being unguarded led to pain, or loss, or sudden change. And the system learned something important. Don't relax too much. That lesson stuck. So now, even when life is stable, your nervous system behaves as if stability needs supervision. You stay alert to shifts in mood, to changes in tone, to signs that something might be off. This scanning doesn't feel dramatic. It feels sensible, responsible, because responsibility has been tied to anticipation. If you anticipate problems, you can manage them. If you're prepared, you won't be blindsided. If you don't trust calm, you won't be devastated when it ends. This logic makes sense, especially if calm ended abruptly in the past. So lowering your guard feels like giving up a critical defense. Not lowering it feels safer, even if it's exhausting. Another layer of this fear is the belief that suffering keeps you sharp. That discomfort keeps you attentive. That ease makes you careless. So vigilance becomes not just protection, but prevention. You believe that if you stay alert, you can stop things from falling apart. This belief gives you a sense of agency. If you're watching closely enough, you'll catch problems early. If you're tense enough, you won't miss warning signs. So tension feels useful. It feels like participation. Relaxation, by contrast, feels passive, as if you're stepping away from your role. And stepping away from your role feels dangerous when that role has kept you safe. This is why lowering your guard can trigger guilt. Not obvious guilt, subtle guilt. A feeling that you're being careless. That you're letting yourself off too easily. That you haven't earned peace. So even when nothing is wrong, you don't allow yourself to fully settle. You stay just tense enough to feel responsible. This tension becomes part of how you define care. Caring means watching. Caring means anticipating. Caring means being ready. So letting go feels like neglect. Neglect of your responsibilities. Neglect of your safety. Neglect of yourself. This belief system doesn't collapse easily, because it's not irrational. It was built on experience. Experience taught your system that ease could be followed by disruption. That calm could be interrupted. That trust could be broken. So your system chose caution. And caution worked. It kept you adaptive. It kept you responsive. It kept you moving forward. So why would it let go now? The problem isn't that vigilance exists. The problem is that vigilance never turns off, even when it's no longer needed. And that constant alertness comes at a cost. You may notice that you struggle to fully enjoy stability, not because you don't value it, but because you don't believe it's safe to trust. You may feel uncomfortable when things are going well, as if something important is missing. That missing thing is often the familiar tension, the signal that tells you you're doing your job. So when tension fades, you feel ungrounded, as if you're not doing enough to prevent what might come next. This is where the fear becomes self-reinforcing. You stay tense to feel safe, but tension makes it impossible to feel safe. So you remain stuck between readiness and exhaustion. Another important layer of this fear is the belief that if you let yourself feel okay, you'll be unprepared when things change. As if trusting calm would make you NAVE. As if enjoying stability would weaken your ability to respond. This belief assumes that vigilance is the only way to stay competent. But that assumption hasn't been tested under new conditions. It belongs to an earlier phase of your life, one where unpredictability was frequent enough to justify constant alertness. But conditions change, and strategies that once protected you can begin to limit you. Still, the system doesn't update automatically. It updates through experience. And experience requires risk. Small risk. The risk of lowering your guard slightly and seeing what happens. Not all at once. Not recklessly. But gradually. Because the fear of lowering your guard isn't about danger. It's about trust. Trust that you'll notice when something actually needs your attention. Trust that you can respond without constant anticipation. Trust that you don't need to suffer in advance to be prepared. That trust doesn't come from thinking differently. It comes from living differently. From moments where you allow yourself to relax and nothing bad happens. Where you trust calm and remain capable. Where you stop bracing and don't fall apart. Each of these moments challenges the old belief. Not by arguing with it, but by contradicting it. Slowly, the system begins to learn something new. That vigilance is not the same as care. That anticipation is not the same as preparedness. That tension is not the same as responsibility. And that learning opens the door to something unfamiliar. A different way of being safe. One that doesn't rely on constant alertness. But before that new way can fully take hold, there's one final shift that needs to happen. A shift from protecting yourself from the future to learning how to stay present in the present. And that's where we need to go next. Trusting that things are okay doesn't happen all at once. There is no moment when vigilance simply disappears. No switch that turns readiness off and calm on. What changes is subtler than that. You begin to notice when you're bracing, and choose not to. You feel the urge to prepare, and let it pass. You sense the tension that usually returns, and don't immediately respond to it. At first, this feels risky, because lowering your guard has long been associated with loss. With surprise, with disappointment. So choosing not to brace can feel irresponsible. But slowly, through experience, that belief begins to loosen. Not because you convince yourself that everything is safe, but because you discover that safety doesn't require constant anticipation. You remain capable even when you're not prepared in advance. You remain attentive even when you're not tense. You remain grounded even when you stop scanning for what might go wrong. This is an important distinction. Preparedness is not the same as vigilance. Responsiveness is not the same as anticipation. Care is not the same as suffering in advance. For a long time, suffering ahead of time felt like protection. If you worried enough, you'd be ready. If you stayed alert, you wouldn't be caught off guard. But readiness doesn't actually come from constant tension. It comes from trust in your ability to respond. And that trust develops through lived moments, not through mental rehearsal. As you begin to stay in moments of calm, without bracing, something shifts. Your body starts to recognize that nothing bad is happening. That this state doesn't require immediate action. That you don't need to supervise your own well-being. Calm becomes less fragile. Not because life stops changing, but because you stop assuming that change will overwhelm you. This is where peace starts to feel different. It no longer feels like a pause before impact. It begins to feel like a place you can stand. You may still notice vigilance returning from time to time. That's not failure. It's habit. Your system remembers what kept you safe before. The goal isn't to erase that memory. It's to add new ones. Memories where you trusted feeling okay and stayed okay. Moments where you allowed yourself to relax and remained intact. Experiences where you didn't anticipate disaster and nothing broke. Over time, these moments accumulate. They quietly reteach your nervous system what safety feels like. Not as constant readiness, but as presence. Presence doesn't mean ignoring reality. It means meeting it as it comes. You don't lose your ability to respond. You don't become careless. You don't stop caring. You simply stop paying the emotional cost of problems that haven't arrived. This shift changes how you relate to yourself. You no longer measure stability by tension. You no longer equate responsibility with suffering. You no longer believe that ease must be temporary. You begin to let okay be enough. Not as a peak state. Not as something to hold on to desperately. But as a legitimate place to be. And this doesn't make you NAVE. It makes you present. You learn that trusting calm doesn't weaken you. It strengthens your ability to stay grounded when things do change. Because now, you're not already exhausted from preparing. You meet challenges with clarity instead of tension. And that changes everything. So if you notice yourself waiting for something to go wrong, pause. Not to correct the thought. Not to reassure yourself. Just to notice. Notice that nothing is happening right now. Notice that you're here. Notice that you're okay in this moment. That noticing is not denial. It's grounding. And grounding doesn't require certainty. It requires presence. Learning to trust feeling okay is not about pretending life is predictable. It's about discovering that you don't need to suffer ahead of time to be prepared. That you can meet reality as it arrives. That calm doesn't have to be temporary to be real. And that being okay, truly okay, is not a trap. It's a state your system can learn to trust. One moment at a time.